Welcome everyone to week 5 of research methods, and this week looking at quantitative research, understanding the numbers. And I'm going to move through this fairly quickly because as you see down at the bottom of this slide, there's actually 2 parts to this presentation because it's a fairly long one this week. So I'm going to move through the slides. This is part A. Hopefully you're getting to this first, and then part B. With these slides, or with this week, of course doing in the news as per usual, and then looking at quantitative research, talking about things like surveys and questionnaires, advantages and disadvantages to quantitative research, and some of the designing of questionnaires. And then part B, we take a look at some more aspects of quantitative research. However, okay, starting in the news. Lonely Planet lists their top cities to visit in 2013. Now they've got a top 10 list. For some reason humans like top 10s, probably because we have 10 fingers, 10 toes. But, and base 10, everything like that. However, I've just listed the top 5. If you want the other 5, you'll have to find it yourself. Lonely Planet. San Francisco, number 1. Amsterdam, number 2. Hyderabad, India, number 3. Derry, Londonderry, number 4. And Beijing, number 5. So these are the top places that Lonely Planet, the publisher, is suggesting that you visit this year. Or if you're not into crowds and doing what everyone else does, these are the places to avoid, I guess. Next story. Surge in bedbug infestations over the past decade. And yes, that is a bedbug that just appeared on your screen. Major consideration when staying in hotels. And there's a concern now that some of these bedbugs are starting to become actually pesticide resistant. So, and with the increase in, and constantly increasing growth in global travel, these bedbugs are having a greater chance of moving around the world. And as well, in our internet and technology connected world, there's already lists of bedbug places. So I guess, as a traveler, wanting to make sure that you're not staying at one of these places that is listed as a bedbug place, and somebody who works in the hospitality industry or hotels and that, accommodations, making sure that you're not on that list, whether legitimately or nowadays illegitimately. People putting you up on the list, competition in that to, sully your name. Anyways, something for you to be thinking about next time you're traveling someplace new. Alright, quantitative research. Now, surveys and questionnaires are probably the most common means of conducting quantitative research, but quantitative research is anything when you're doing with the numbers. So there's lots of other aspects, for example, observation research, which can also be quantitative. So don't get stuck on just surveys and questionnaires. Essentially looking at the collection of data on a number of units, usually a single point in time or a single general point in time. For example, maybe the summer, spring, things like that. And what you're really trying to do is to systematically collect this quantifiable data. So there needs to be some sort of system that you're doing it in order for you to be collecting data that is all comparable to itself. And you're probably looking for patterns of association, some connections, things like that. And surveys and questionnaires are everywhere. You'll see surveys and questionnaires being quoted, used for marketing, product development, political decisions, managing organizations, human resources, everything. And because of how often it's used, there's a real premium on making sure that it's done accurately, and that it's interpreted accurately because of how often decisions are made based on quantitative data. So, it needs to be done properly and needs to be reported and analyzed properly as well. Large-scale surveys, quite often when you're doing it for a big business, it can be very labor-intensive and resource-intensive, but it doesn't have to be. Especially with all of the new technologies nowadays, you can get a lot of good quantitative research done fairly quickly and inexpensively. For example, in the past, and I've been doing quantitative research for a while, you'd look at quite a lead up, and the actual collection of the data took quite a while, and then completion of it, entering of the data itself into a computer for analysis. All of that could be quite a long process. Nowadays, online, you can get up and running, completed, and essentially done your research within a couple of weeks, or faster sometimes, depending upon how complex your research is. So things have really changed with quantitative research. In addition to that, automated quantitative research, quantitative surveys, traffic counts, and things like that, where you've got machines doing all the work for you. Some advantages to questionnaires. They can be, and they should be, relatively simple and straightforward. You can usually adapt them to pretty much any population, and that's where you really have to make sure that you've adapted it to the needs and abilities of the people that are being questioned or being surveyed. You can get, or you should get, very beautiful standardized data that you can work with and do all sorts of manipulations, especially if you do have that sort of quantitative bent or ability. And as I said previously, especially nowadays, you can get a large quantity of data in a very short period of time. You can get hundreds or even thousands of responses online within, days, if not weeks. So, it's terrific nowadays with technology and quantitative data. Other possible advantages: that it can be anonymous, and can be much more anonymous than it would be if it was for a personal interview or focus groups or anything like that. You may never ever know who these people are that are filling out the questionnaires, which gives them a greater possibility of being honest sometimes. And because the data is numbers and can be put into beautiful graphs and charts and things like that, people tend to believe and trust the data. So, it's much easier to communicate the information at times through quantitative versus qualitative means. Some disadvantages, though. You're really relying on respondents who make mistakes. Humans are humans. And so some of the questions you may be asking them, you may not, as nice as these people are and as truthful as they're trying to be, they may not be able to correctly provide you with the information you're looking for. For example, if I was to ask any of you how much you spent on your last trip, and for you to not only quantify how much you spent in the trip, but exactly identify what things you spent your money on, I'm sure that you might give your best guess, but chances are very few of you would be very accurate in the information that you're providing me. In fact, if I told you or asked you how you spent every hour of your day yesterday, you would probably have a difficult time. But that's what sometimes people are asked to do. So you really have to think about, when you're doing this sort of quantitative research, how you're going to do it and how you're going to make sure that there's as few mistakes and as few errors as possible. People may not want to answer accurately at times. A lot of people, when you're asking them questions, especially questions that might have a politically correct answer, will probably try to, or at least some of them, will try to portray themselves in a much more socially acceptable light. For example, asking people about how much they recycle. And you'll quite often get people identifying in a higher percentage than the reality how many of them are actually recycling. Or asking somebody, are you willing to pay a little bit more for that money to go towards the environment? And you'll get a higher percentage of people agreeing, yes, I'll pay X amount of dollars, when in reality, when they're actually given that choice, a much smaller percentage will actually follow through on that. Some questionnaires can have a low response rate, especially since, or depending upon who you're trying to survey. And if those people that are not answering your questionnaire are substantially different than those that are, then you can have a real issue with the information that you're gathering. Other possible disadvantages. If you haven't properly tested your questionnaire, there may be misunderstandings, misinterpretations of the questions that you never know. Some respondents may not take the research seriously, which is starting to be some of the questions coming out with some of these online panels, and how many of these people are taking things completely seriously as long as they're getting paid. Some respondents may feel that their answers are not completely anonymous, so they don't want to give you a completely accurate response. And finally, because questionnaires and surveys are seemingly very easy to put together, you can get a lot of mistakes in how it's put together, the types of questions that are asked, the responses that are provided, all sorts of places where mistakes can be made in the actual creation of the questionnaire. It's not, you can't just ask questions. It's not that simple. So lots of possible places to be careful. A couple of other things to think about when you're talking about surveys or research in general. Internal validity. And this is making sure that, for example, the people that you're talking to and asking questions, their responses accurately reflect their true feelings, their true thinkings, things like that. Whether it's providing an accurate assessment of the people that you're talking to. External validity, however, is making sure that the information that you've gathered is applicable beyond that group that you've just talked to. For example, you start talking to people you want to find out how people are like on the beach, and if you're only talking to, for example, this group in the picture, all around the same age, probably same lifestyle, but trying to take that information from them and put it across the whole population, it's probably not going to be very accurate. By the way, if you're hearing a funny sound in the background, that's just my dog having sleep terrors or sleep barking. Some other things about questionnaires. While a lot of them you'll see are generally just descriptive purposes, 26% believe something else, 12% blah, blah, blah. You can use it for some interpretation, some greater understanding of what's going on, things like correlations. But if you're just doing a simple questionnaire, don't make this mistake between equating correlation with causation. You know, correlation means you're seeing two things occurring at the same time or one after the other, things like that. Causation means one thing causes the other. So there is quite a large difference between the two, and you need to be careful how you interpret your information. In order to go beyond simple description, you tend to need, a lot more information, more variables, and to be able to truly understand what's going on. And looking for some of these strong correlations. If you're not experimenting, you're probably just seeing correlations, not causations. Generally, you don't want to use surveys for exploratory research. And partly that's because if you really don't have a base understanding of what's going on, it's very difficult to design a questionnaire that accurately reflects and accurately can question what's going on in the situation. So you're more likely in an exploratory situation to use qualitative research, and then you may go from that qualitative research and qualitative understanding and then do a bit of quantitative research. A few central features of a survey. Things like a fixed quantitative design, collecting of data in a very standardized format, meaning that they're all collected in a similar fashion in order for them to be comparable. A selective sample of individuals from the population. Usually you will sample a population, you won't census a population. Census meaning where you try to get everybody in a certain population, unless your population is very small. Then you might consider doing a census instead of a sample. When it comes to designing surveys and questionnaires, you've got a few different options, different ways where you can actually administer it. In the past, mail questionnaires were probably one of the biggest things, and personal interviews. Telephone surveys are still used fairly regularly. I'm sure many of you have gotten those sort of telephone surveys. But a lot of the surveys, a lot of the research now is shifting online, where some of those questions are sent out, people agree to be on panels or agree to answer a few questions in order to get, entry into a contest, things like that, or newsletters. So online is where a lot of the research is heading towards. But again, not all surveys are necessarily a questionnaire, and not all surveys necessarily require somebody to actually answer questions. Because a survey can be like a traffic survey where data is collected as people are going by somewhere and things like that. And depending upon how it's administered, the format can change very drastically. For example, online surveys are now starting to include some audio and video clips. And in fact, the research that I'm doing, I used a full video that I was showing the people that were participating. So there's getting to be a lot more options available online. Much of your online surveys are, very quick and easy to complete, but again, you have to be careful to make sure that it's completely understood and that you've tested it properly prior to putting it out. Most online surveys require some sort of email list, or some will use an online panel, things like that. Some way to encourage people to go to the website and to answer the questions. And one very important aspect of that then is making sure that the people who are answering your online questionnaire or answering your questionnaire period are truly representative of the population you're trying to understand. Now, for example, when I was working with the Canadian Tourism Commission and we were doing a lot of online research, we weren't concerned by the fact that many people don't have access to computers, because we were, the population we were targeting, the people we were trying to understand for our marketing purposes, we assumed that the vast majority of them should have a computer. People that didn't have a computer, we understood that we weren't targeting them with our marketing. So the fact that we weren't going to reach them, weren't going to question them, weren't going to have them in part of our survey was not a concern, because really they weren't part of our population. And nowadays, any one of you can administer a survey through services like SurveyMonkey. And those of you that haven't checked out SurveyMonkey or things like that before, check them out. They're actually very easy to use. Quite often they even come with some standard questions and standard formats to help you on your way. But again, it's best to have your questionnaire, your survey designed before you start playing around on SurveyMonkey, because there can be a lot of errors, and errors that you wouldn't notice and you can easily pass over, just thinking that it's been covered. Because you could do it on SurveyMonkey, it must be okay. Some design considerations, things to think about when you're putting a questionnaire together. Things like, how long is it going to take for the person to complete it? And this is very important, because this will affect the type of people that will complete your questionnaire, and so the type of population, the type of answers you'll get. And not only, in general, but also specifically thinking about from the start of the questionnaire to the end of the questionnaire. Because the longer questionnaires go, the less accurate your questions can become. If they start to stretch out too long, then people start answering it not caring about their answers. As well, depending upon how you're administering the questionnaire, that can change and affect how long your questionnaire can be. For example, I show there, personal and telephone interviews tend to be shorter or have a shorter time that you should go, because they tend to be more difficult and people can't do as many questions. So if you're trying to do the same number of questions, whether you're going personal or online, personal will take longer. Complexity of questionnaires. Make sure you've pre-tested them, and depending upon how you're trying to, if you're trying to administer it potentially online versus over the phone, the complexity of your questionnaire has to be varied depending upon how you're administering it. Online questionnaires can generally be more difficult because people have an easier time reading than they do just listening to the questions. Whether you need visual aids, other things to think about. Visual aids, telephone surveys, of course, unless you've pre-sent out something, you can't show them a visual aid. Whether or not people are going to care about your questionnaire, so respondent buy-in, and you really need to make it beneficial, either psychologically or financially or some way for the person to answer your questionnaire. the need for anonymity. People tend to be more honest when their responses when their anonymity is guaranteed. But sometimes that anonymity cannot be guaranteed because of the types of questions or the types of people that you're trying to survey. So all these sorts of things being things that you need to think about when you're creating and designing and administering a questionnaire. Anyways, time for you guys to go on to part 2 and the rest of quantitative research. All right, thanks guys.